So welcome to the second part of spinal cord and spinal nerves. Today we're going to talk about the spinal nerves. And so let's review just a little bit. So remember, between each two vertebrae, there's a pair of nerves that come off, and these are called spinal nerves. And don't forget that the vertebrae are divided up into regions: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal, and so are the nerves. And so we have cervical nerves, we have thoracic nerves, lumbar, and so on. Well, if you remember how many vertebrae there were, when you look at the cervical vertebrae, there were 7 cervical vertebrae. If you look at the thoracic, there were 12. If you look at lumbar, there were 5. And then sacral, remember we had 5 vertebrae, but all fused into a single bone. And then we had the coccygeal, same thing as well. So when you look at the number of nerves, it's almost identical to the number of vertebrae. There is one difference though, and that's right here. The first cervical spinal nerve comes off above the first vertebra. So it comes off above the atlas. And when it comes off above the atlas, that creates one more space for a nerve. And so there's one more pair of cervical spinal nerves than there are cervical vertebrae. So 7 cervical vertebrae, but 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. The rest of them are exactly the same. 12 vertebrae, 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves, 5 here, 5 here, and so on. And so if you add up how many vertebrae there are, remember, you're going to have one extra nerve. And so when we look at this, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Well, let's talk about what a nerve is exactly. So remember we said in the beginning that if you're in the central nervous system, we have these things called centers or nuclei. Well, that is exactly the same thing as what we have in the peripheral nervous system, but in the peripheral nervous system, they're called ganglia. And then we also said that in the central nervous system, we have these bundles of fibers, bundles of axons. Well, in the central nervous system, they're called tracts. Well, we have the exact same thing in the peripheral nervous system, except in the peripheral nervous system, they're called nerves. So a nerve and a tract are basically the exact same thing. They're just found in different locations. Well, when you look at any nerve or tract, it's more than just the neuron. It's more than just the neuron plus the oligodendrocytes or Schwann cells. It's also connective tissue. So if we look at a nerve, it looks like this. So the whole thing is a nerve, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of axons. There's one axon. So every one that you see that's an axon. And then remember, most, or at least most, axons have myelin around them. And so this is the myelin sheath here. This is the Schwann cell. Now, if we were in the central nervous system, remember that wouldn't be a Schwann cell. It would be an oligodendrocyte. But here we're in the peripheral, so it's a Schwann cell. But around each one of these, to keep these things from touching each other, there's a bundle of connective tissue. So there's a layer of connective tissue that surrounds the axon and the Schwann cell. And that layer of connective tissue isolates this from all of the others. Well, if you remember when we looked at muscles, we saw something very similar. And if this were a muscle fiber, this would be called the endomysium. Well, here, almost exactly the same. It's called the endoneurium. And so neurium refers to this nerve. And then remember what we saw with the muscle. We saw that there were bundles of these, and they're create these cords, which are called fascicles. And so a cord then is going to have a bunch of these inside it. And so here's one, and so on. Well, there's also connective tissue that separates the fascicles from each other as well. And if you look at that, this is the layer of connective tissue here. And if you remember when we talked about muscle, this would be called the perimysium. Well, again, here it's almost identical, but it's perineurium. And then if you remember when we talked about muscles, the whole muscle has connective tissue around it. So when you put all these bundles together, there's a layer of connective tissue around the outside, just like there was with the muscle. And in the muscle, that would have been called the epimysium. Well, here it's called the epineurium. And so all of these are isolated from each other. And so we have these three layers of connective tissue. We have the epineurium, which surrounds the whole nerve. It goes around the outside. It surrounds the whole nerve. And then within that, remember, we have fascicles, and so there's connective tissue that surrounds the fascicle. And that is the perineurium. And then when you look at the individual muscle cells, we have the endomysium. Well, when we look at the individual axons, we have the endoneurium. And so when we go back to this picture, hopefully you can pick that out. So if you look down here, here's a diagram, but here is a real one. And so if you go in there and look, there's an axon right there, and that white around it, those are the Schwann cells. And then around that is this connective tissue. So there's connective tissue right there. And then it's easy to see this connective tissue here and so on. And if you blew it way back out, you would see that there's connective tissue around this whole thing. So if we blow that up a little bit, it looks like this. And so again, we can see these different coverings. So here is the epineurium, and here the perineurium, and here the endoneurium. Does it make sense? Any questions? So here's an actual picture that shows that, and there's our epineurium, and there's one of those fascicles, and so around that here is the perineurium, and if we blow that up, you can see this perineurium here very easily. And so it's this connective tissue that surrounds the fascicle. So all of these nerves look like that. So let's talk about them. Again, remember there are 31 pairs of these spinal nerves. Well, think about what a nerve is. So here's the brain, and here's the spinal cords, what we're talking about, and here are these nerves. So there's one nerve this way, and here's this way. This is a single pair of nerves. If we blow it up and make that big, here's one pair of nerves right here. Well, if we look inside it, we're going to see axons. But the axons actually go in two directions. Some axons go this way. So they're sensory neurons. They're carrying information to the central nervous system. But some are going this way. And so they're carrying information away from the spinal cord, away from the central nervous system. And so these that go toward, remember, are called sensory, are called afferent. And these that go away, remember, they're motor, they're also called efferent. Well, look at this. In the exact same nerve, we have both afferent and efferent neurons, which means that when you look at this nerve, it's mixed because it has both. It has both sensory and motor fibers. And so here's our sensory fiber, and here's our motor fiber. It has both. And that's the way all spinal nerves are. Every single spinal nerve is mixed. And so within the same nerve, we're going to have sensory fibers, afferent fibers, and we're going to have motor fibers, efferent fibers. So if we look at that, that's true for every single one of these nerves. Every spinal nerve is mixed. Well, here is a nerve right here. So this nerve is mixed. And so look, this information here is going this way. It's going in like this. So that's a sensory neuron. But this information right here is going this way. And so to use a sort of an analogy like a highway, this is like a two-lane highway. So if you drive out in the country, a two-lane highway has traffic going in both directions, and the only thing separating it is a little dotted line. That's it. So there's constantly traffic going in both directions on this highway, and that's the way nerves are. They're like a two-lane highway. But think about what happens when a two-lane highway gets close to a town or a city. What tends to happen is the road will split. And what we get is all the traffic that's going into the city will be on one side. So everything that's going in is going to be on one side. And everything that's coming out of the city is going to be on the other side. That way, the traffic doesn't mix up or doesn't crash together as easily and so on. And then there's sort of a median in between the two. Well, that's exactly the way these nerves are. When you look at the nerve away from the spinal cord, it's mixed. Every single one of them, it's mixed. Over here, same thing. But when you get close to the spinal cord, the paths separate. And what we get are called roots. So it's not a nerve anymore, it's a root. So this is a root right here, and this is a root, this is a root, and this is a root. And when you look at the roots are not mixed. The dorsal root is all sensory. All sensory. There are no motor fibers in the dorsal root. So that one's all sensory, this one's all sensory, this one's all sensory, and this one is. The dorsal root is all sensory. But if you look at the other root, this one, the ventral root is all motor, all motor. And so every single fiber that's in that root, that's in this root, that's in this root, is a motor fiber. So when you look at the nerve itself, remember the nerve is mixed. But when you look at the roots, the two roots are very different. And so when we look at this, what we see is there's a dorsal root and a ventral root. And again, the dorsal root is all sensory and the ventral root is all motor. Another thing is when you look at these nerves, you can see little connections. And so we see these little things here, they're connections. And what this does is it allows the connection, it allows the nerve to either be split off or it allows a connection to the another part of the nervous system. One last thing is if you look at a root, here's a root. When you get close enough to the spinal cord, it divides into even little smaller roots, and these are called rootlets. So we have roots and we have rootlets. And this is true for every single one of these. So if we were to blow up this one, or blow up this one, or blow up this one, this is what it would look like. Any questions? So here's another view of that. So again, here's the spinal cord right here, and here's the spinal cord here. Here's the nerve right here, and here's the nerve out here. But again, when you get close to the spinal cord, we divide up into two roots. And so you can see these two roots. Here's the dorsal root right here, and here's the ventral root right here. And again, the dorsal root, all it has is sensory neurons in it. Dorsal root is all sensory. But if you look at the ventral root, look, it's all motor. This doesn't say motor, but that's motor as well. It's all motor. But if you look here, look, we see both sensory and motor. That is mixed. Any questions? So here is a real spinal cord, and we can see exactly the same thing. So out here would be the nerve. That's where the nerve is. And remember, the nerve is mixed. But look, here you can see where it's split. So here's one root right here. And there's another root right there. They've split apart. This one is the dorsal root. And this one is the ventral root. Well, remember we've talked a couple of different ways about how you can tell dorsal from ventral. And we said that one of the ways was to look at the horns. So remember, the dorsal horns are pointy and they go all the way to the surface. The ventral horns are round like this. So that's one way to say it, because this side is dorsal and this side is ventral. But now we have another way to tell them apart, and that is to look at the two roots. So if you look at the dorsal root, look, it's not just straight. It has this thing right here, and it's called a ganglion. So back to that thing we talked about just a minute ago. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Here's the central nervous system. Out here's peripheral. If it were inside, like in here, it would be called a center or a nucleus, but it's outside. And so there's one on every single dorsal root. And if we look here, we can see that. That's the dorsal root ganglion. And look, that's that cell body right there of sensory neurons. So it's a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. And so if we looked in here, we would see a bunch of these. Here's one, and here's another one. And so that the reason the cell bodies are, the reason it's bigger is because the cell bodies are bigger. And so it looks like a swollen area, because that's where all those cell bodies are located. Again, this is called the dorsal root ganglion. So every single one of these nerves has a dorsal root ganglion. So now there's several ways to tell anterior from posterior. Here is the dorsal root ganglion on this. There's the dorsal root ganglion. You can see this big swollen area right here. Big swollen area. And if you were to blow it up, you would see cell bodies. And even when it's not blown up, you can look in here and you can see cell bodies in here. You're not going to find cell bodies anywhere else in the nerve or the roots except in this dorsal root ganglion. There's another view right there. And so look, pointy goes all the way to the surface. Dorsal root ganglion. This side is the dorsal side, or the posterior side. I want to show you one other way to tell anterior from posterior. And that is, if you look right here, look, you see these little indentions. Well, if you look in the very center, there's an indention there. Same thing on this side. But look at the two indentions. The one on the dorsal side is very shallow, but the one on the ventral side is very deep. So that's another way to tell anterior from posterior. Here, this is not very deep. It's like a groove, so it's called a sulcus. Here it's very deep, so it's called a fissure. And you can see that fissure right here. It runs up and down the spinal cord on the anterior side. And you should be able to see that in any picture. Now this one's not quite as obvious, but there it is right there. It actually goes all the way to there. And then here it is on this side, and here you can see that little indentation on that side. So this is the posterior median sulcus. And this is the anterior median fissure. Hopefully you can see all of those things that we just talked about. So by now, you should know pretty much the anatomy of this. So we talked about the central canal. We talked about the gray matter. And remember, the gray matter is divided up into these horns. We have a posterior horn, an anterior horn, a lateral horn. We have this little gray commissure that runs in the middle. Right in the center of that is that central canal. And then we have the white matter. And remember, that's divided up into funiculi. And so we have a posterior, an anterior, and lateral funiculus on each side. And now we've talked about the nerves. And so you can see the roots. There's the dorsal root and the ventral root. And then you can see the dorsal root has this dorsal root ganglion. We had already talked about the meninges. There's the dura mater, the arachnoid, the pia mater. So there's really nothing in this picture that you shouldn't know about. And then the last thing I just mentioned to you was these indentions. This one's a deep indention and this one's shallow. That's the posterior median sulcus and the anterior median fissure. Okay, so we already know that we have a nerve and we have a dorsal root and we have a ventral root. So here's the nerve right here. There's the dorsal root right there with a dorsal root ganglion. And there's the ventral root right here. But what we haven't talked about is it's kind of like the same thing we talked about in a highway. If you're out in the country, remember it's like a two-lane highway. Well, if you're still out in the country and you get to a place where the road splits, what's going to happen is you're not going to have to go one way. You can go either way. The road has just split. So this is still going to be a two-way road. This is still going to be a two-way road. That's exactly the way this is. The nerve splits away from the spinal cord. So when it splits away from the spinal cord, we don't get roots. We get what's called a ramus. Ramus just means branch. So look, the root branched off, and one branch went this way, and another branch went this way. So there are two rami. There's a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. But look at this. The dorsal ramus has sensory neurons and it has motor neurons. The ventral ramus has sensory neurons and it has motor neurons. So rami are mixed. So when we go back and look at this, we have the nerve and then we have the dorsal root, which is only sensory. We have the ventral root, which is only motor. But then we have the splits, the branches, the rami of the nerve. And there's a dorsal ramus, which is mixed. And there's a ventral ramus, which is mixed. Well, why do we have this split? The reason is because if this is our brain and here's our spinal cord, there's stuff behind the spinal cord. There's muscle and skin and all that behind the spinal cord. And there's stuff in front of the spinal cord, all out here in front of the spinal cord. And so look, if you think about this, here's this person's chest, and then there's belly, and then leg. And then if you think about this, here's the person's back muscles and buttocks and stuff like that. And so neurons have to run in both directions. And so there are sensory and motor from this direction, and there's sensory and motor from this direction. And so if you look at a ramus, the dorsal ramus is mixed, and it goes to and from the skin and muscles behind the spinal cord. The ventral ramus, it's mixed, and it goes to the skin and muscles in front of the spinal cord. So if we go back to this picture, your arm, your shoulder is in front of the spinal cord. Well, we want to have sensory reception from our skin, our hand. That goes in, and look, it goes in this ramus. We also want to be able to control muscles. It comes out this ramus. But again, when you get close to the spinal cord, these neurons are going to only go in one direction. All of the sensory neurons, every single one of them, when you get close enough to the spinal cord, they're going to go in on the dorsal root. The motor neurons, they're all going to come out the ventral root. But the nerve is mixed, and so are the rami. Well, if we follow those nerves, those neurons, out all the way to the skin, all the way to out here, and we see what part of the skin this particular neuron comes from, this particular nerve comes from, we can figure out a map. We get a whole map of the skin. And that map represents the area of skin that's serviced by a particular nerve. And what it's going to do is it's going to show us the pathway of the nerve. Well, when you do that, that area of skin is called a dermatome. So a dermatome is nothing but the area of skin innervated by one pair of spinal nerves. And so when we look at all these spinal nerves, they're going to go to or come from a dermatome. And what we're going to get is a map. And so when we look at the skin, we're going to see a map of the pathways that the nerves take. Here's what dermatomes look like. So look, here are all of our nerves. There's C2, C3, C4, all those nerves, all the way to CO1. Well, look, if you look, there's a pathway this nerve takes. The easiest place to see this and to recognize it is in the thoracic part. So look from here to here, here to here. And look, we can see this nerve. So if we pick a single nerve, let's say we pick T5. T5 only goes to this area of the skin on both sides. Same thing over here, this area of skin on both sides. So look, it makes like a belt around the person's body. Same thing with T7, T8. Look, it's this way and this way. And again, it's this way and this way. It makes like a belt around the person's body. So we can follow the path of that nerve on the skin. But when we look at it, T2 to T12 are just straight across. T2 to T12. Look at it. It looks almost like sliced bread. You can see the pathway is just straight across, just like sliced bread. Same thing on the back, T2 to T12. But if you look at other dermatomes, they don't look like that. So if we come down here and look at the legs, look, they're not straight across, they're at an angle. And if you look on the back side of the legs, look at what it looks like here. It looks like this. This is the pathway of the dermatomes. And if you look on the neck, look, the neck comes out and it looks normal here, but look, this one goes all the way down to your hand. You can see it all the way down to here, or all the way down to there. So something different is happening in T2 to T12 than is happening everywhere else. And so what we're going to see is that in T2 to T12, the nerves just come off and they go straight to where they're going. And look, you can see that. Here's T2 to T12 right here. And again, it looks just like sliced bread, like a loaf of bread that's been sliced. But look at these others. They don't match up. Look at this yellow one. It's this little part right here, and then it comes all the way down like this and forms a bigger part down here. So something different is happening. Well, let's talk about what's going on. So T2 to T12, they just go straight to where they're going. There's no recombination. They go straight to the area they innervate, T2 to T12. But the others don't do that. The others make these little places where they combine and recombine before they're going to where they're going. See how straight these are? Look at them. They're not connected to each other in any way. But if you look at these others, look, there are these connections. These connections are called plexuses. But remember, when we look at this, we can see the area of the nerve or the skin that's serviced by a single nerve. Well, one impact of that is something that happens when you get shingles. So what shingles is, it's a disease that's left over from chicken pox. So if you had chicken pox when you were a kid, this is a virus. It's called herpes zoster, but it's a zoster virus. You get over the chicken pox, but the virus never goes away, because what it does is it hides in these nerve cell bodies right here. It gets inside those cell bodies. Well, normally what we do when a virus is in a cell body, we just kill the cell. So we just destroy that cell. But you can't do that with neurons because we don't replace neurons very easily. So if you were to kill that neuron, everything that was associated with this neuron wouldn't work anymore. You'd have numbness wherever that was supposed to be, because that's a sensory neuron. It wouldn't work. And so our bodies don't kill the virus. We just let it sit there and hide inside here, which is fine. It doesn't do anything. But at some point in your life, probably you're going to have a depressed immune system. And what's going to happen is that virus is going to travel down this neuron, down the axon, until it gets to the skin where this axon is going. And when it gets to the skin, it's going to invade those skin cells and it's going to multiply, and it's going to cause this very, very, very painful rash. And that's exactly what you see here. So look, here's where the virus was hiding, right in there and right in there. It reactivated, it traveled down this axon. And then wherever this axon goes, all these skin cells in this area It leaves the axon, enters those skin cells, and multiplies like crazy, and this is what you get. Now, because of it's associated with these sensory neurons go crazy, and you experience very, very painful conditions. It burns. That's painful to the touch. You can't move without it hurting like crazy. But look, this shingles followed the dermatome. It followed the path of that nerve. So back to the dermatomes, you can see which areas would be affected. Now let's go the other way. Which areas would be affected if different nerves were infected? So if it was this nerve that was infected, it would travel here. And here's what the rash would look like, all like that. If it were this nerve, the rash would follow this pattern right here. If it's this nerve, this is the pattern right here. Does it make sense? But again, when we look at T2 to T12, the pathways are just straight. They just go straight to wherever they're going. So if we look at those nerves, they look like this. Or on the model, they look like this. And look at that. It looks just like a loaf of bread that's been sliced. So can herpes virus affect any nerve in the body? It can affect any nerve, any of these spinal nerves or cranial nerves as well. So yes, basically the answer is yes. But look, this is T2 to T12. That doesn't happen with the other nerves because they don't look like sliced bread. They do this thing where they combine and recombine. They form these things called plexuses. And the best way I can sort of describe a plexus is to look at something like this. Look at this. This is the high five or someplace in Dallas. And what is it? It's an interchange is what it is. It's where several roads come together. So theoretically, no matter on which road you're on, if you take the right path, you can get to where you're going. And you could go this way, or you could go this way, or you could go wherever you want to go, because they're all like an interchange. And that's exactly what these plexuses are like. So there are 4 of these plexuses. One of them's in the neck. It's called the cervical plexus. And look at it. It looks, if you blow it up, looks very much like that. There's another one in the shoulder area, which is called the brachial plexus, and it looks very much like that. There are 2 other plexuses as well. There's a cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. So there are these 4 large plexuses. And it's not every nerve that's involved in every plexus. It's only specific nerves. So if you look at the cervical plexus, it's C1 to C5. If you look at the brachial plexus, it's C5 to T1. Lumbar, L1 to L4, and sacral, L4 to S4. So there's the cervical plexus right there. There's the brachial plexus right there. There's the lumbar plexus, and then there's the sacral one. Well, let's look at these plexuses, and we're going to look at the cervical one first. So remember, it's C1 to C5. It's not the whole nerve, though. Remember the nerve, when it comes off the spinal cord, here's the spinal cord, and we have the roots, here's the roots. But we also have Rami out here where it splits and goes this way, dorsal, or it goes this way, ventral. Well, it's not the whole nerve. It's only the ventral ramus that forms this plexus. And so when you talk about the cervical plexus, it's the ventral rami of nerves C1 to C5. And this is what it looks like. Look at it. Again, if you look at that, it looks just like that interchange system on a highway. It's all tangled and it's all combining and recombining and so on. But again, it's the ventral nerves of C1 or ventral ramus of C1 to C5. Well, there's a bunch of nerves that come off of here. And if you take this in a graduate level class or even a higher level class, you might have to learn all of these branches that come off of here. Certainly if you ever go to some place like med school or someplace like a PA school or something like that. We're only going to learn one of these. So the only one we're going to look at and learn is this one. It's called the phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve is a really, really, really important nerve because what it goes to is your diaphragm. And the diaphragm is the primary muscle of breathing. It's an inspiratory muscle. And so if you want to breathe in, we contract this diaphragm. Well, this is skeletal muscle. The diaphragm is skeletal muscle. And remember, skeletal muscle is voluntary. So we have to tell it to contract or it won't. And so this nerve, which comes off of the cervical plexus, then goes to the diaphragm and tells the diaphragm to contract. Well, if we look at where the nerve comes off, here's the nerve, and if we follow it here, look, it doesn't come off up here. It comes off right here at 3, 4, and 5. So a little bit comes off at 3, a little bit 4, and a little bit at 5. And so there's this little saying that says nerves 3, 4, and 5 can save your life. And the reason it says that, or it says to be that, is because these are the parts that control the diaphragm. And so if you damage the spinal cord above 3, so if you were to break your neck or have some sort of fracture or something above 3, look, that nerve has not come off yet. So everything above this damage right here will work, but everything below it is not going to work. And so if you're above C3, you're not going to be able to breathe on your own. But if you break the neck below here, like down here somewhere, or certainly any further down, that nerve has already exited. And so the nerve will work and you can breathe on your own. And so again, C3 through 5 can save your life. Here's another view, a little simpler view of the cervical plexus. And then of course, here's our phrenic nerve right here. And don't forget, that goes to the diaphragm. When we look at these nerves in lab, we'll see where the pathway is and look what it looks like. But again, it's coming off right here. So if you follow this nerve, look, there's a branch here, a branch here, and a branch here. But if you get above that, it has no part of that. Let's look at the brachial plexus. So remember, the word brachial actually means arm. And so the nerves that come off of the brachial plexus go to the arm. The brachial plexus is very complicated if you try to dissect it out. So here are the nerves over here. So they first combine and they form what are called trunks. And then the trunks split up and they combine and then they form cords. And then the cords combine and they split up and they form nerves. Well, there are 5 nerves that we're going to look at. 5 nerves, and these control all of the muscles of the arm, so they go to every single muscle. They also carry every sensation from the skin to the spinal cord into the brain. And so anything that you associate with the arm, movement, or any kind of sensation has to go through this brachial plexus. Here's a little simplified view. Again, you can see the trunks, you can see the cords, and then here are those nerves, these 5 nerves. So let's look at these 5 nerves. One of them is called the axillary nerve. So the axillary is called that. You can't see it in this picture, but the axillary goes through the armpit. It goes through the armpit, and then it curls around the head of the humerus. And so the axillary is going to go to the muscles of this shoulder part. They go to the deltoid, and they go to the teres minor. And then they're going to supply sensation from the skin, from this whole area right here on the top of the shoulder. That's what this nerve does. The next one is called the musculocutaneous. So the musculocutaneous, when you look at it, and again, you can't see it in this picture very well, but where it goes to the biceps muscle, the biceps brachii, and to the brachialis muscles. And so these 2 muscles, remember, are what's going to cause flexion of the forearm. And so this nerve is going to allow you to bend your arm at the elbow. It's also going to carry all of the sensory information from the elbow back up, basically, to the shoulder. These other 3 nerves actually go down into the lower arm. And so there's 3 of these. Well, remember, in the lower arm, we have 2 bones. On the thumb side is the radius, and there's a nerve that runs right along the radius, so it's called the radial nerve. On the little finger side is the ulna. And so, just like on this side, there's a nerve that runs right alongside it. It's called the ulnar nerve. There's also a nerve right in the middle between the 2 bones. It comes right down the center right here and in through the hand. It's right in the middle, so it's called the median nerve. So those are those 5 nerves. We have the axillary, and here's the axillary right here. Remember, it goes through the armpit and then curls around. And the musculocutaneous is here, and it's going to go to this part of the arm. And then these 3 down here go to the lower arm and to the hand. Well, the hand is extremely sensitive, and so the hand has tons of axons that go from it, especially from the fingertips and places like that. And so all 3 of these nerves service the hand. And so if you look at the hand, it's divided up into 3 colors here. So everywhere you see purple, that's the radial nerve. And everywhere you see pink, that's the ulnar nerve. And then everywhere you see yellow, that's the median nerve. Well, if you damage one of these nerves, you're going to impact these areas that it goes to. So if you damage the radial nerve, the part that's going to not work very well, and it's not going to have any sensation or anything, is this place where it's purple. If you damage the ulnar nerve, your little fingers are not going to work very well, and you're going to lose sensation here. And if you damage the middle or median nerve, all of this and this is not going to work very well. Well, something that's fairly common is if you blow this area right here up, I don't know if you remember the hand when we talked about it. Remember there's 8 carpal bones, and they're in 2 rows of 4. And then remember we have the metacarpals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we have the phalanges. So the hand looks a little bit like this. Well, this part right here makes a curve, and it forms what's called a carpal tunnel. So the carpal tunnel is right there. And what runs through that carpal tunnel is this median nerve. So the median nerve comes down here like this, and it runs right through the middle of this tunnel. So the nerve is running right there. Well, whenever you use your hand a whole lot, or if you bruise the hand or something like that, you can cause inflammation in this carpal tunnel. And what happens is you get swelling. And when that swelling happens, what happens, because the nerve is in the middle, is the nerve gets constricted. And so everywhere this nerve goes, it's not going to work very well because the nerve is constricted here and it can't do what it's supposed to do. So that means that anything that's yellow on this person's hand is not going to work very well, and there's going to be a lot of pain coming from those areas. And so you probably have heard of people with carpal tunnel syndrome. And carpal tunnel syndrome happens exactly the way we just talked about. And look which parts of the hand are not going to work. The thumb just doesn't work anymore. And these two fingers don't contract. They don't move anymore. They don't work anymore. The index and the middle finger. And not only that, you get pain from these areas. So this whole area feels like it's burning and aching and hurting and painful. It does not affect any other part of the hand. So the rest of this part of the hand, it's just fine. It's only the yellow parts of the hand. Is this the same as anatomical snuff box? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but carpal tunnel syndrome is pretty common. And again, it's due to swelling and inflammation in this area right here. So the way to treat this is to try to reduce the inflammation first. So they give you anti-inflammatory drugs. They also immobilize your hand so you can't use it, so that you can't irritate the structures. And then hopefully the swelling goes down. Well, as soon as the swelling goes down, all the pain disappears and all of the loss of function disappears. But for most people, as soon as they start using it again, it's going to start swelling again, and they're going to wind up with the same problem again and again. So a common surgical technique is to go in and enlarge the carpal tunnel. So they remove the tissues from around the nerve, so they enlarge the carpal tunnel. Sometimes this is called nervous entrapment. Maybe that's what you mean by anatomical snuff box, but they enlarge the area around, and that gives them the nerve room to work. So we blow that up. There's the carpal tunnel right there. Here's the nerve going right through the middle, and then here are these areas that are going to be affected. Remember, only the yellow parts are going to be affected by this. Any questions? So here are those nerves. Again, there are 5 of them. All right. Let's look at the lumbar plexus. So remember, it's only the ventral ramus, but it's the ventral ramus of L1 to L4. And so if you look at it, this is where it is right here. And so here is the plexus here. And look, there's a bunch of nerves that come off of here as well. And these nerves basically go to the inside of the thigh and the front of the thigh. They also travel all the way down the inside of the medial portion of the lower leg as well. But this controls all of the muscles in these areas. And again, it's going to be associated with all the sensations from the skin in these areas. And so when you look at it, the areas that are mostly involved are the muscles that are right here, So the muscles that are right here are the quadriceps muscles. But it's also the muscles that are right here. And so that includes things like the pectineus and the iliopsoas and the adductor longus and adductor magnus. And then also down in this area right here. And so the major nerves that come off of here, we're only going to learn two. One is the femoral, and the other is the obturator. So the femoral is this big, long nerve. It starts right here, and it goes down. Well, it goes all the way down beside the femur, but it actually keeps going. But the femur stops right here at the knee. And so it wouldn't make sense to keep calling this the femur, even though or the femoral, even though it keeps going. So when you get to the knee, the name changes. Even though it's the exact same nerve, the name changes. And so the femoral becomes the saphenous. And so above the knee, it's the femoral. Below the knee, it's the saphenous. Another major nerve that we're going to look at and talk about a little bit is this one. And that's the obturator nerve. And the reason it's called that is because it goes through the obturator foramen. And where it goes to the inside of the thigh. So anything associated with the groin area, this nerve is associated with it. And so we're going to see the thigh muscles, the muscles of the lower abdominal wall, and then the muscles of the groin. Remember, it also goes all the way down right here as the saphenous nerve. And what it does is it continues to the foot. And so this part of the foot and the leg is the saphenous nerve. And even this tiny bit of little part right here. And so if you damage this nerve down here, these are the areas of the foot that are going to be affected. The last one we're going to look at is the sacral plexus. So the sacral plexus, again, from the ventral rami of L4 to S4. And this runs down the back of your leg. So if you turn away, look, his toes are pointing this way. We're looking at the back leg. And so here's the sacral plexus right here. And the largest nerve in your body comes off of the sacral plexus. It's called the sciatic. And so the sciatic is a huge nerve. Here it is right here. And look, it comes off, part of it comes off here, part of it comes off here, part of it comes off here. And so all of that forms this sacral nerve. Sciatic nerve. Well, remember the sciatic nerve goes through the greater and lesser sciatic notches. And so when you look at this picture, you can see that there are easily two branches. So there it goes through the greater sciatic notch, that goes through the lesser sciatic notch. And if you look down here, you can see just how big this nerve is. It's about the size of your index finger. So look down at your own index finger. That's about the size of that nerve. It's huge. Well, when you look at the sciatic nerve, it's really a combination of two nerves. And we can see that in this picture. One's green and one's yellow. The green one is called the tibial. And the yellow one is called the fibular or common fibular. So it's a combination of these two nerves. So here's the tibial, and there's the common fibular. And when they get down, eventually they're going to split apart. And so if we look at this picture here, we're going to see that the tibial runs along the tibia, and the common fibular runs right next to the fibula. And so right here is where they split, right there. And one part goes down by the tibia, goes all the way under to the bottom of your foot. The other one goes down the side of the leg next to the fibula. If we blow it up, there you can see the two nerves right next to each other. And again, if we blow it up some even more, right here's where they split. So there's the tibial, and there's the common fibula right there. And so basically, where it goes is everywhere on the back of the leg. So it goes to the buttock muscles, it goes to the pelvic muscles and the area around the anus. It also goes down to the back of the lower limb. And so if we follow it down, it goes all the way down to the foot. And so if you look at the foot here, anything that's not this color, so this yellow and the pink and orange and all that kind of stuff, anything that's not this blue color comes off of this nerve. And so if you damage this nerve, the back of the leg gives you pain all the way down. The foot gives you pain all the way down, even on the bottom of the foot, up the side of the leg, all the way. And so it basically controls most of the lower limb. Well, a pretty common problem with this is called sciatica. So sciatica is when you get an inflammation of the sciatic nerve. And so anything that this nerve goes to or from is going to be affected. And since it runs all the way down the leg, people get pain here in the butt. They get pain on the back of the thigh. They get pain on the side of the leg, all the way down, even under that, all the way to their toes. It's funny, sciatica used to be called fat wallet disease. Why in the world would you call this fat wallet disease? Think about a wallet. Where do most people carry a wallet? They carry it in one of their back pockets, not both, just one. And then when they sit down, look what happens. Here's the wallet right here. And here comes the nerve. And as you sit there on that wallet, you're compressing the nerve like crazy. So Johanna said, compress the nerve. That's exactly right. So if I compress the nerve right here, then everything below that nerve is going to be impacted. Everything below the wallet. So all of this, I'm going to get loss of function, and I'm going to get this pain, and it's a burning, hurtful pain all the way down your foot. It's usually only on one leg, and that's usually because one leg is more compressed than the other one. So one of the worst things you can do is sit on something like this for long periods of time. So if you do happen to carry your wallet in your back pocket, what you should do, and before you sit down, is you should take your wallet out, especially if you're going on a long car ride or maybe an airplane ride. And then think about this. Some people, they spend their whole work day sitting on their butt at an office desk or in a car or in an airplane or so on. So those are the people that are most susceptible to this issue. Any questions about that? So how important are these plexuses from the exam point of view? You will have to know the plexuses, and you'll have to know the nerves that come off of them. You don't have to know specific muscles, but you should know the area that they go to. Like the femoral is the thigh, whereas the sciatic is the back of the thigh. Remember, the cervical was the upper neck and shoulder area and diaphragm, things like that. Okay, well, let's talk about some things that can go wrong with the spinal cord and spinal nerves. One of the worst things that can happen to the spinal cord or spinal nerves is when you have some sort of trauma that results in a loss of function. So the function can be motor or it can be sensory, depending on the area of the spinal cord that's involved. If it's a motor function and you lose that, we call that paralysis. So paralysis is a loss of motor function. It has nothing to do with sensory, although that might happen at the same time. It's a loss of motor function. Well, there's two kinds of paralysis. One kind of paralysis is called flaccid paralysis. So what flaccid means is that the muscles never contract. There's no contraction whatsoever. No voluntary, but also no involuntary contractions. They're soft. They're always soft. They're limp. If you pick one up, your limb, and drop it, it just flops. They're soft. There's limp. There's no contractions of any muscles. Well, flaccid paralysis is different from another kind. Remember we talked about how the brain and then the spinal cord, and we said it takes more than one neuron to get out to the muscles. So remember, one neuron is going to start here and it's going to go down the spinal cord, but at the level where the spinal cord, where it exits, we're going to get a synapse and a different neuron is going to go to the muscle. So there's two neurons here. Remember we called them the upper motor neuron. So this one's the upper motor. And we called the one that goes directly to the muscle the lower motor neuron. Well, when you have flaccid paralysis, there's damage to this neuron. This neuron doesn't work anymore. So no matter what you want to do, no matter what the idea is, I want to pick up my leg, I want to walk or whatever, I cannot communicate with the muscle, and so the muscle never ever contracts. There's no way for the muscle to contract because skeletal muscles don't contract unless they're told to, so it never contracts. So that's flaccid paralysis. But there's also another kind of paralysis, which is called spastic paralysis. So spastic comes from the same word as spasm. And what a spasm is when a muscle contracts and you cannot tell it to relax. So it contracts and then it stays contracted. So I can not tell it to contract. The best way to think of this in a normal person is to think of something like a Charlie horse or a cramp that you get after exercising. Think about what that is. The muscle just contracts and it stays contracted. Even though you telling it stop that, stop that, stop that, it does not stop contracting. The only way to get it fixed is to massage it, send more blood to the area, and so on. Well, again, let's go back to this. Here's our brain and our spinal cord, and then again, we got these two nerves. So we have this one nerve, which we already talked about, that goes directly to the muscle. Remember, that's the lower motor neuron. But we have this other one too, which comes from the brain and goes down the spinal cord to synapse with that one. That's that upper motor neuron. Well, in spastic paralysis, this is the one that doesn't work. This neuron, there's something wrong with it. We've damaged it and it does not work anymore. But the lower motor neuron still works. And so what happens is, even though we're not consciously telling it to the muscle to contract, the spinal cord in this area starts sending out action potentials, And those action potentials, when they get to the nerve, they tell the nerve to contract. And so what happens is irregularly, not on a regular basis, but irregularly, all of a sudden the muscles will start contracting and they'll be rigid and they stay contracted. So if a person has spastic paralysis, and let's say they're confined to a bed, what's going to happen is every so often muscles are just going to contract. And so what's going to happen is their hands are going to contract, and their arms are going to contract, and their legs are going to contract. And you go into the room where this patient is, and they're curled up into this fetal position, and every single muscle, or at least some muscles, are just so contracted. And the only way, just like with a cramp, the only way to get this to relax is with massage and things like that, and stretching, until finally those neurons stop telling the muscle to contract, and then it can relax again. So you get these irregularly contractions. They're stimulated irregularly. So with flaccid paralysis, they never ever contract. They never contract. Whether you want them to or you don't want them to, has no control. But with spastic paralysis, they contract on their own. It's not voluntary. They contract on their own, but it happens on this irregular basis. Another way to talk about paralysis is to talk about which parts of the body are affected. Remember, it's a loss of motor control. So if you only lose motor control in the lower limbs, it's called paraplegia. But if you lose it in all four limbs, quad, it's called quadriplegia. And that often happens when you have spinal injuries. So if you think again about the brain and the spinal cord, and we got these nerves that come off, 31 pairs. Well, if the spinal cord is damaged here, these nerves aren't involved. They still work. So that one works and that one works. But these nerves don't work. And so everything that they go to is paralyzed. But if the spinal cord damage is here, then these don't work either. These don't work, these don't work, and so on. And so both the upper and lower extremities are involved. Another thing that can happen, though, is you can have a stroke or something like a tumor or something that's only affecting one side. So it could be a tumor right here, or it could be a tumor up here. But it's only going to affect this side of the body if it's this one, because remember, we get crossing over. So these nerves on this side are not going to work. If it's down here and it's already crossed, then these nerves on this side are not going to work. And so it's only on one side of the body. So one arm, one leg, one whole side of the body. But in other words, it's half. And the word for half is hemi. So this is hemiplegia. So these are those different types of paralysis. So you certainly should know what these words mean and be able to understand what's going on with them. We should also talk about, besides the spinal cord being a two-way pathway, remember it's this brain and here's the spinal cord. Remember, neurons and tracts are going up to send information, and they're coming down to send information. So again, it's like this two-way street or two-way highway. But that's not all it does. There's a whole bunch of things that the spinal cord does on its own. You can take a frog. So here's a frog. Wow, I cannot draw with a mouse. But anyway, there's a frog. If you put a pair of scissors in its mouth and you cut its head off, look, you completely cut its head off. Here's its head over here. That frog has no brain. And so you would think that the frog wouldn't be able to do anything. But believe it or not, there's a bunch of things this frog can still do. It can still hop. It can still swim. It can, if you flip it over and put it on its back, it can right itself. If you put acid on its back, it'll take its leg and wipe the acid away, or try to. It can do all those things without a brain. And so all of these things are being processed somewhere else. They're being processed in the spinal cord. You may have heard the old saying, you're running around like a chicken with their head cut off. So here's a chicken. Again, I can't draw very well with a mouse, but anyway, let's pretend it's a chicken. So look, you chop this chicken's head off. Here's its head over here, and you cut it off. And yet, this chicken without a head can run. It can flap its wings. Now, it may not actually be able to fly, and of course it can't see where it's going, but it can flap its wings. It can walk. It can do all sorts of things. In fact, there was a chicken, a rooster, who had his head chopped off, and then he lived for another 18 months. What the farmer noticed was this chicken, this rooster, was walking around with the rest of the chickens like it was a normal thing. And so what he started doing is he started using an eyedropper, and he fed the chicken this way with an eyedropper down in the esophagus. And the chicken lived. It lived for 1.5 years. The only reason it actually died is because the farmer went away on a vacation and he had somebody else take care of it. And they put the tube in the wrong pipe, and they put the tube in its trachea, and so it choked. And it finally stopped walking around and doing all that. But again, it could do all these things without a brain. And that's because all these things are processed, or were processed, in the spinal cord. Well, we talked about a little bit about processing already. And one of the things we said that it could be processed serially. Remember, serial processing happens in a series. And so first we have a stimulus. It's picked up by a receptor. It goes in. We're going to process it in here, in the spinal cord. That's where the processing is happening. And then it's going to go out, and we're going to get some sort of response. So if you touch something hot, what's going to happen is you're going to jerk your hand away. You're going to remove yourself from that painful stimulus. But it doesn't happen in the brain. It happens in the spinal cord. In fact, if you touch something hot, you will move your hand before you realize it's hot. That is a reflex. And reflexes are processed in lots of different ways, but a lot of them are processed in the spinal cord. Well, when you look at reflexes, you can categorize them. So here's a reflex. Look, this person steps on something painful. He stepped on a nail. As soon as that nail gets in the foot, it creates this stimulus. The stimulus is going to go in on a sensory neuron. It's going to be processed here in the spinal cord in an interneuron or association neuron. It's going to come out to the muscle, and the muscle is going to jerk the person's foot up, and you're going to lift your leg. Again, look, you don't see brain here. It happens in the spinal cord. And look, the processing is very, very simple. Look, it only included 3 neurons. It's very simple, but it's still sensory processing. Well, reflexes can be classified. And the different ways that we classify them are these. One way to classify them is, are you born with it? In other words, does a baby have it? You're born with it, or is it something that you learn? So as you get older, do you learn it? Another way to classify it is, where is the processing happening? It can happen in the spinal cord, but it can also happen in the brain. So think about this. Here's the spinal cord down here. But what if something comes flying toward your eyeball? What do you tend to do when you see something flying toward your eye? So here's a bug, and he's flying right toward your eye. What do you think you're going to do? You're going to blink to keep that thing out of the eye. Well, the spinal cord's down here. This is up here in the head. And so that's a cranial reflex. Another way to classify them is, does it include skeletal muscle, or does it include some sort of internal organ? So is it somatic or is it visceral? Remember, another word for visceral is autonomic. And then finally, the last way to classify it is to count how many synapses are involved. And it's either one or it's more than one. So we have monosynaptic and we have polysynaptic. So we can classify all of these reflexes different ways. We can classify them by development, by processing site, by response, where does the response happen, or by how many neurons are involved, the complexity of the circuit. So if we took a particular synapse, or a particular reflex, we should be able to classify it all these different ways. So again, innate. Innate means that you're born with it. It happens during fetal development. So the day you're born. So think about a baby. If you pinch a baby's toes, what do you think it's going to do besides cry? What's it going to do? Is it going to keep letting you do it, or what's it going to do with its toes? It's going to pull away. And that happens the very day that baby is born. So it's an innate reflex. But what would happen if you throw a ball to a baby? You throw a ball to a baby, what's going to happen? It's going to hit it right in the head. But if you let that baby grow up a little bit, and it begins to learn some things, and you throw a ball to the baby, it'll either move and get out of the way, or if it's a little bit later on, it might even catch it. But that's a learned reflex, an acquired reflex. Again, cranial happens in the brain. So these are things like the corneal reflexes on the eye. Or if you think about something like if you get pepper in your nose and you sneeze, or you cough, or any of those things associated with the head or the face. The body, though, anything below the neck is going to be a spinal reflex. And so again, it's going to be anything like withdrawal or anything like that, or you pull your hand away from something that hurts, or anything associated with that. It's a spinal reflex. And then somatic is all about skeletal muscle. Visceral is all about internal organs. And then finally, we're going to count how many synapses there are. So look, this one only includes 2 neurons. So how many synapses are there? Just 1. But this one includes 3 neurons. So how many synapses are there? There's 2. And if there's more than 1, it's a polysynaptic. So if we were to take a particular synapse, we should be able to classify it. We should be able to decide, Is it something people are born with, or do they learn it? So we classify it that way. Does it include skeletal muscle or an internal organ? We classify it this way. Is it happening in the brain or the spinal cord? We'd classify it this way. And then how many synapses are involved? And we would classify it this way. And so if we look at this one, let's look at it. So look, you put your hand down on attack, you jerk your hand away. Well, do you think you were born with this response, or did you learn to do it? You're born with it. This is innate. Where did the processing happen? Did it happen up here in the brain, or did it happen in the spinal cord? It happened in the spinal cord. Count the number of synapses. There's one here and one here. It's 2, so it's polysynaptic. And look, it includes skeletal muscle, and so it's somatic. And I would like you to be able to do that. I'd like you to be able to look at a reflex and classify it all these different ways. So here's a typical reflex. And look, there's the stimulus. Someone used a needle or a pin and they stuck it in your skin. And then here's our receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, effector, and finally some sort of response. And that's those 5 steps right here. Now, if we look at a typical reflex, look, here's one. This person put their hand down and jerked away. That happened in the spinal cord. But think about this. If I put my hand down on an attack, am I going to know it? Am I going to feel the pain? I am. That doesn't happen in the spinal cord. That happens in the brain. So look what happens right here. This pathway splits right here. And one goes to be part of this reflex. But one goes this way, and it goes up to the brain. And this is the path that it's going to take right here. We already know this. These are those spinothalamic tracts because they carry pain. So remember, spinothalamics takes 3 neurons to get to where we're going. There's a first order, second order, a third order. They're going to cross over, so we're going to get decussation. And then they're going to go to a very particular part of the brain, so we have somatotopy. We can see all of that right here. So if we take this and use this right here, that's exactly what we see. So there's going to be a reflex. It's going to jerk this hand away, but at the same time, information from this is going to go up brain or up to the brain. It's going to go to a very specific spot associated with the fingers. And this is where we're going to register pain. This is where pain perception happens. So remember our frog? Our frog had no brain. Remember our chicken that ran around with no head? It had no brain. Neither of them feel pain. They would not feel pain. That doesn't mean they wouldn't respond to a stimulus. They would. But it does not mean that they're feeling any pain. So when you hear that a person or a patient something is brain dead, do you think they can still have these reflexes down here like this? Yes, yes. They can still have reflexes because the spinal cord, is the spinal cord dead? It's not. It works just fine. And this happens. But do they feel pain? No, exactly. A person who might be called brain dead would be a little bit like our rooster that had its head cut off. I don't know if you technically could call that rooster alive. I don't know. And that's exactly the way it is when you have a patient who's brain dead in a bed. Do you call that person alive? I don't know. But they're certainly not functioning the way that they're supposed to. And even though that rooster lived for another 18 months, that rooster was not functioning the way it was supposed to. So here's that tract again. There's our first order neuron right here. Here's our second order neuron right there. And third order neuron here. Here's where they cross over right there. There's the decussation. And then it goes to a specific spot. Remember, that's somatotopy. The simplest reflex in our body is one called a stretch reflex. So if you look at a stretch reflex, it's very simple because this neuron is connected directly to this neuron. Look, there's only one synapse. And so if you go to the doctor and they do this to you, what's going to happen is in response to this stretch of this tendon, the muscle's going to contract and your leg's going to fly up. Well, think about this. Why in the world would you have this reflex? People don't hit you on the knee with a hammer very often, but it doesn't have anything to do with that. It has to do with all sorts of things like walking and stuff like that. Think about yourself. If you're walking along, and I don't know, you're not exactly watching the ground, but you're walking. As long as the ground is completely smooth, everything's fine. But what happens when all of a sudden there's a little dip right here and you step in it? Well, unless your muscles contract like this, what's going to happen is you're going to fall. You're going to fall flat of your face. And falling is one of the easiest ways for people to get hurt. 99% of the time, though, you don't fall. Now, if it's a deep enough hole, you probably do. But if it's just a little dip in the walk like this, or if you're going up a hill and it's like this, uneven all the way up, you don't fall over and over and over again as you climb this hill. What happens is your muscles respond to the unevenness. They respond to this extra stretch by contracting and keeping you from falling down. Every muscle in your body will do this. And so you can do this anywhere where there's a tendon close to the surface and see the muscle contract. If you look at this one, look, here is that withdrawal reflex. Well, look, it's a little more complicated because there's two synapses. There's 3 neurons involved. So it's going to be a little bit slower. Even though when you jerk your hand away pretty fast, it's not as fast as this one because there's only one delay here. This one has 2 delays. And the more neurons that get involved and the more complicated it is, the slower it's going to be. So if you look at this one here, we stepped on this tack. That one is pretty simple, but look what else has to happen. To keep you from falling down, when this leg goes up, this leg has to go down. And look how complicated this reflex is getting. And again, it's all happening in the spinal cord. So it's two reflexes that are happening at the same time. There's the flexor, but there's also the extensors. Withdrawal on this side, extension on this side. Well, remember, spinal reflexes happen in the spinal cord, and they seem like they're involuntary. And for the most part, they kind of are. But if you anticipate it, you know it's going to happen, you can either help it, facilitate it, or you can prevent it, inhibit it. And remember when we talked about how there were 3 neurons? So we have a neuron like this, but there's another neuron talking to this one before that one talks to this one. And so remember we talked about presynaptic facilitation and presynaptic inhibition? Well, here you can see how those sort of work. If you anticipate the reflex, you know it's going to happen, you can speed up the reflex so it's easier for you to do something like catch a baseball or get out of the way if you're playing dodgeball. If you know it's going to happen and you anticipate the reflex, you can inhibit the reflex. So you can hold still if you're going to get a shot, a vaccination, or you can grab onto something that's hot and keep holding on, even though the reflex is for you to let go. And then the last thing is some reflexes go away. As we get older, some reflexes are replaced with other reflexes. One of those is this. If you take a baby, a little baby, and you rake across the bottom of its foot like this, its toe will stick up and point this way. But if you let that baby get older and turn into a child where it's walking around, or an adult, and you rake across the bottom of its foot, this is what's going to happen. So somewhere between being a baby and being a child, this reflex goes away and this reflex starts. And what happens is in the central nervous system, as it matures, it inhibits that first reflex and replaces it with the second one. This one is called the Babinski reflex or Babinski sign. This one's called the plantar reflex or plantar sign. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove the Babinski and replace it with the plantar. So you may have been watching a medical drama and there's a guy on a gurney, he's been in a car accident and he's covered up with a sheet, and then they take him to the ER, and one of the first things they do is they throw back that sheet and they rake across the bottom of his foot like this. And then what they look for is does this happen or does this happen? It tells the doctor, is the central nervous system working? Is it still in contact with this leg? Or is the central nervous system not working? It's no longer in contact with this leg. And so it's a good sign that there's some sort of damage to the brain or the spinal cord. Nobody's absolutely sure why we have a Babinski reflex as a child, but most people think it has something to do with our ancestors, when our ancestors lived in trees and babies clung to their parents. So when babies cling to their parents, they need all of these toes and fingers in this position to hang on. But when we moved out of the trees and started walking, think about your foot. If it's in this position over here, it doesn't walk very well. We walk heel to toe, and we want the toe to grip the ground. And so we go from clinging to our parents to walking and gripping the ground. Now, it may not be that obvious anymore because human infants are pretty unable to do anything. But if you think about some other animals like gorillas or orangutans or something like that, they cling to their parents very tightly as they climb through the trees. And so that reflex is really, really important. Anybody have any questions? So that's the end of that chapter, and that's where we stop today.